Now, do I sit down here? Am I all right if I sit down here? That's okay, and then I might just put that here. Right, thank you. Thank you very much, Jenny, for showing me around yesterday. We won't talk about how you showed me around, but gosh, it was fun. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's lovely to be in Taiwan again. Can I just check out, is Yingye Chen online as well? Jenny, you said she is, and it's so good because she gave me a lot of the data that I first used about 10 years ago, I think, looking at suicide. Oh, is she there? Right. Hello. Hello, Yingye. I don't think I've met her in person, but she was very helpful at that time ago. Oh, hi. Good to see you.
Hi,
So I have quite a lot of things I could say. I hope I'll leave out a lot of it because it could get very boring for you. And I'm very happy to be interrupted at any stage to talk about any of the things I want to talk about. First thing is just to acknowledge that there are 8 billion people in the world, and 40% of those 8 billion are in either China, mainland China here, or India. And the rest of us make up the other, whatever it is, 5 billion. And approximately 1% of those 8 billion people will die by suicide, maybe more. And that's quite a large number, 10%. So that's about, what did you get, 880, about 100 million of us in the world will die by suicide. But we don't know that number because there's a lot of data from various countries around the world, which is not very good. The data aren't very good. They're not accurate. And in fact, a majority of the countries of the world do not produce accurate data. Taiwan does, as far as we know. Australia does, Germany does, a lot of developed countries do. And it is interesting looking at those data that they, to some extent, are inaccurate also because of hidden suicides. And by hidden suicides, I mean suicides that have been called something else. And maybe this, they'd be coded as accidents or as event of undetermined intent or ill-defined and unknown cause of death. Those would be the main ones. And some of the natural caused deaths, in theory, natural deaths, were probably suicides, but the person who killed himself or herself disguised that fact. So why does suicide get miscoded? These are the reasons. You can read them yourself. The person took steps to ensure the death wasn't recognized as suicide. There was deliberate misrepresentation or underreporting by the family, informants, or those wishing to protect against hurt or stigma or punitive consequences, because in some countries, suicide is still a crime. Thirdly, and importantly, inquiries and investigations were inadequate, and this applies to many other countries of the world. And maybe that's because of under-resourcing. They haven't got the money, they haven't got the resources to employ people to gather all the data. They can't spend time doing forensic autopsies or psychological autopsies or verbal autopsies. So they don't get the accuracy one would like. And finally, certification and or coding of death done by the people who were meant to do it very carefully was inappropriate, such as ascribing the death to something that could never be considered as an underlying cause. Doctors who see a person and they call it something else. And training and policies regarding coding may have been inadequate, so that's why they don't get reported appropriately. And that's why I want to talk a bit about garbage codes and talk about how that came into it. Do you all know about garbage codes? And do you know where it came from? Maybe not, right. Well, oh, please, yes, please.
大家可以听得懂，就是为什么会 miscoded， 就是因为可能有很多调查的过程，就是在澳洲他们会有2次的那个公告自杀率，但是台湾只有1次。那因为我们没有去做那个校正，但是他讲的就是说，为什么澳洲要有2次，就是因为他们会有一些的这种出入，就是他们都会去做详细的调查。然后去了解说，他那个死因到底是不是属于自杀？那等一下他就会开始讲那个 hoax 的部分。那这边有没有补充？对，
直接用。
就是主要在讲上面，就是说在那里 miscoded 的原因，就包括说，第一个是自杀的人他们本身采取措施，导致说他们的死因不会被classify 为自杀，然后呢，有可能就是在旁边可能是家人或者碰到发生这件事情的人，他们在回报这件事情的时候，他们可能会想要保护这个人from可能是伤害，然后或是一些社会的压力等等。然后呢，还有就是在调查自杀的事件的时候，有可能没有足够的资源去做这件事情，所以导致说自杀的原因没有被真正的回报出来。
对啊，好，谢谢补充哈，所以蛮清楚的，很多的原因可能造成这个状况。OK，carry on.
So garbage codes, this relates to inaccuracies of recording of reasons for death. But the trouble is that back in 1948, the World Health Assembly introduced the 6th revision of the ICD, ICD 6. You all know about ICD 11, that's the latest classification of diseases. This was back in 48, and with that, the Assembly said that what we need to do is to record the single underlying cause of death. And so far, so good. But unfortunately, they also introduced into ICD 6 a way of coding things that weren't going to lead to death, but diseases or conditions that people saw in hospitals or that doctors saw in their surgeries outside in rural areas that weren't going to lead to death, but it was useful to be able to record why they'd been in hospital or why they were seeing the doctor. And many of those are listed here up the top. These are natural causes, ill-defined cardiovascular diseases such as heart failure. Heart failure, perfectly reasonable thing for writing down as a cause of death, but heart failure can be due to all sorts of different things, as can unspecified stroke, as can ill-defined cancers. Pulmonary edema, we were talking, Jenny, about pulmonary edema. Is that a cause of death? Yes, people can die with it, but it's not the underlying cause of death. And what Murray and Lopez felt should be called garbage codes were these things that couldn't lead to death, weren't the cause of death. They were part of the reason, but they weren't the underlying thing, and the thing that the public health doctors needed to know about and to be able to analyze. And there's one chapter of the ICD classification, which is chapter 18. It's the R chapter. And a lot of the things there, I mean, things like proteinuria get mentioned as the condition that they saw. And proteinuria has been written by some doctors as the cause of death, and that would be inappropriate. So would heartburn, so would skin eruptions. Senility is a garbage code because that doesn't say why the person died. It was an age-related physical disability, R54, but that doesn't tell you whether they had Alzheimer's or some other cause. So these are garbage codes. They are not, in most cases, they are not things that might be substituted for suicide or for accidents or the external causes. So down below here, I've got the hidden suicides that I've mentioned. And accident would be one of those. Exposure to an unspecified factor causing injury is a garbage code. That's the one accident that gets included. But the other ones, they are external causes. They are not natural causes. But then I was thinking, why I couldn't sleep last night was thinking about other things that could cause death, such as anorexia nervosa. Is that imposed externally? Is that an external cause? What about asbestosis? There are lifestyle factors that can lead to death. They're natural causes, but they're not that natural because it all depends on, well, I mean, for example, smoking, nicotine, that can lead to death, but it's regarded as a natural death. What I'm talking about in relation to hidden suicides is those where suicide is a self-inflicted death, that you cause your own death and you mean to. Something like event of undetermined intent, which is used, and I'll talk about later, that we don't know that they really meant to kill themselves, but it's certainly an external cause. Somebody who killed themselves by hanging, and we don't know if they intended to, but much more it applies to poisoning or drowning, where you really don't know whether they intended to. And that's where the coders and the doctors may not get it right. So let's just talk about R99. R99 is a garbage code, except that some people, you really don't know on autopsy, if having done verbal autopsy, etc. You still don't know after all the investigations that all the developed countries in the world can do. You still don't know whether it really was an external cause or whether it was a natural cause. So that R99 is the code assigned when little or no information is available about the person or the cause of death. They're not examined till long after death, maybe remote location, you can't get clinicians to go and see the person, no informants to give details. It's assigned as an initial provisional diagnosis while waiting for more information. And this applies particularly where it goes to a coroner or a medical examiner. And you, Jenny, and Ming, you have coroners here. You have a coroner's court. Is the person called a coroner? Not called a medical examiner? Right. So that is a legal hearing to decide whether the person died from, for example, suicide, whether it was an accident, whether it was a homicide, and there are some other causes, or if they definitely died from an external cause, but it was undetermined whether the person intended to die. So event of undetermined intent, this code was introduced later than 1948. And in a case where evidence shows that the death resulted from an external cause, for example, where testing shows the manner of death to have been drug poisoning, or it was due to drowning or a fall from a height, but there's doubt about whether it was a suicide, accident, or purposeful killing by someone else. Was it undetermined? And the appropriate code in these cases is EUI, which is Y10 up to Y34. I think 34 is where you don't know what the event was, and you don't know whether it was determined or what. So WHO states that the EUI codes are all garbage codes because they shouldn't be used for saying what the death was, because it gives no information to the public health doctors who are going to analyze it. They're garbage codes. It's a pejorative word. Pejorative? Do you know what that means? It's a word where somebody's wanting to demean something. It's not a nice word.
You know, that's fine.
That's fine. Okay, good. Let's see where I've got to in this. I've got a table here, and this really is comparing a number of countries, including Taiwan, and looking at the suicide rates, looking at the EUI rates, looking at the R99 rates, and looking at accidental poisoning. I haven't put in accidental drowning because that's rather lower rates. And I haven't put in car crashes, which is a sort of condition. You really don't know what the rate of car crashes that were intended to kill the person were. But here you've got a range. And as you see, the suicide rate is highest in Korea and Japan, of these countries, all providing good data. And you see that the R99 rates are fairly raised in Korea and Japan, but the EUI and the EUI rates are at the higher level too. But look down those lists, you see that US, France, Australia, Germany, the rates are all in the medium range of about 12 to 15. And you get right down to Spain and England and Wales, a rate of 7.1. But in England and Wales, the EUI rate is higher. It was 2 per 100,000. It's come down recently because they've had a change in the definition from the medical one to the legal one, the legal one to the medical one, sorry. And you look at R99 rates and you see that Korea has quite a high R99 rate compared with some of these countries. They don't correlate well with the suicide rate, and nor does the EUI rate correlate well with the suicide rate, and nor does the accidental poisoning. So I'm going to move on from there. Here's the R99 pattern of males and females in Taiwan. And you see that almost all, the vast majority of R99 deaths, and in very old age, it's up to over 140 per 100,000, very high compared to the suicide rate. But most of the lifespan, there are very few or relatively few R99 deaths. So this is an exponential growth. And I think this suggests to me that almost all those deaths, it's because the coders or the doctors who assign the codes, they reckon that this was a death. They didn't know what the cause was among these elderly people, very elderly people. So it might be heart failure or some other condition, but they can't decide. So it was coded as ill-defined and unknown cause. So that's Taiwan. This is comparing the same for males. Sorry, that's females. I'm going back one. Here's males in 9 different countries. And you see that most of them have an exponential growth across the age range, somewhat less obvious than in Taiwan, looking at France, for example. But the one exception, the major exception to that, is England and Wales, where the R99 rates, the ill-defined and unknown cause deaths per 100,000, stay roughly the same across the whole life course, so that they're lower in very old age than they are in late middle age. Whereas for all the others, including the USA, including Australia, including Korea, it is very definitely an exponential growth rate. And for women, it's much the same. And there, again, the England and Wales rate of R99 deaths remains low across right until age 85. So obviously, they do not have R99 as a major hidden suicide possibility. And the others probably don't, because across a lot of the age range, because it doesn't happen till old age. There are exceptions to that, which I will talk about later on. So, excuse me if I turn on my notes, because I don't want to miss out on something. Let's focus on the EUI deaths now, the second column in this table. The term was introduced in 1968 in ICD-8 to label any injury or external death for which the intention could not be established. And is that something I'm doing? No, hope not. So general understanding is that the term undetermined death equates to EUI deaths, though Varnick et al. Stated it, and I'm quoting, other subcategories of death from external causes, such as accidents and homicides, may also be classified as undetermined in some situations. Some nations, looking at this table, assign proportionally few or no deaths to any EUI code. So in those nations, EUI is not a major cause of hidden suicides. But in other cases, and that would include Korea, Sweden, and England and Wales, there's definitely a possibility that EUI is a source of hidden suicides. And taking England in particular, England and Wales, they did research around the 2000 or little after 2000, showing that a majority of cases of EUI were recognized by psychiatrists as being cases of suicide, even though they'd been coded as event of undetermined intent. And the ways psychiatrists were able to get that was by doing further psychological autopsy or verbal autopsy, or getting further information that informed them that they were really suicides. So in England and Wales now, they report a combination of the EUI rate and the suicide rate as being the official suicide rate in England and Wales. Other countries, for example, Spain, where the rate is 0.1 for EUI, Netherlands, 0.2, Italy, 0. They don't record anyone as having event of undetermined intent. So clearly, they do not combine EUI and suicide to form the official suicide rate. But there are some countries that follow England's example. So that's of interest. Lee et al. Found that 42.5% of undetermined deaths in Shanghai were probably suicides, with deaths by drowning being the most commonly misclassified, followed by jumping and poisoning by solids or liquids. And interestingly, Rocket et al. In the United States, he's a guy who seems to have done more on hidden suicides than almost anyone. He declared that EUI deaths were the mortality category most prone to contain misclassified suicides. But clearly that doesn't apply in these countries I've already mentioned. Central to the process of officially labeling a suicide is the need to recognize the cause of death, recognize whether the death was deliberately self-inflicted with the intention of ending life. And as I say, England and Wales is a fascinating example where they have changed the definition so that the EUI rate has now come down because they've got a wider definition of what suicide could be due to. Yes, please.
Where different countries regard how they calculate the true suicide rates. So England and Wales is the only country currently to calculate, to combine suicide rate with EUI rate.
I think one or two others do as well. Yes.
In Taiwan, 大家可以看到那个台湾现在是15.5. In Taiwan, the number as suicide rate we count as 15.5 on average, but we don't count EUI. 但那个在英国就是英国他们是7.1+2，所以其实看起来7.1好像很低。我们一般的诠释也是这样，会觉得说好像那个数字比较低，但其实不是。他们只是把它区分到 EUI 去了，所以它的 EUI 反而比较高，相对比较高。然后 R99 looking at the R99, 就是 England and Wales have a relatively lower rate of R99. Okay, just to point out some key points.
Thank you very much. Studies in the UK, I've mentioned that already. What have I done? All right. Around half the deaths coded as undetermined deaths in the US, the United States, have been drug overdose deaths. And 1/6 of those EUI deaths have been drownings. But the proportion of drug overdose deaths in the US and Canada labeled as suicide is surprisingly low. The injuries resulting from less effortful activities, overdose rather than hanging, for example, are much less likely to be judged as suicides as opposed to undetermined deaths. So that is of interest. I'm going to look at several age patterns now, because these are have I done something that I shouldn't? No? Good. Let's stop. Age patterns of suicide and of EUI death rates are similar in some countries. And for example, here you've got suicide and EUI in Sweden, very similar across the age range, and this is males. You notice the difference from R99, the age pattern. This is Japan. Again, the age patterns of suicide and EUI deaths are much the same. Males in the US, age patterns are much the same. The UK, it's different. EUI rates, I mean, they're fairly straight across the age range, but there's a big bump in the middle age and then a lowering of suicide rate in old age, rising to a high rate at age 85. And Mexico, completely different patterns, except after the middle age. Across the youth and early middle age, EUI and suicide go in opposite directions. Taiwan, I don't think you call those age patterns the same. This is looking at blue, the top is suicide in males, and EUI, the bottom in blue, that's steady across the whole age range. And EUI in females, again steady, but rather a higher and fluctuating rate in males. So that differs, and that is of interest. And I'll be talking about age patterns later. Okay, the third likely haven for hidden suicides is accidental death. In Taiwan during the 1990s, published rates of suicide and undetermined deaths increased, but reductions occurred in deaths classified as accidental poisoning or drowning. It was suggested that there had been misclassification of suicides prior to that time. Chang et al. In a paper titled Hidden Suicide Amongst Deaths Certified as Undetermined Intent. Accident by pesticide poisoning and accident by suffocation in Taiwan wrote that suicide rates were being underestimated by more than 30% in Taiwan because some suicides were hidden amongst deaths certified to other causes. So that was a major reference to hidden suicides. Now, it's likely that a substantial proportion of drowning deaths in some countries have been suicides. But if there's nothing, for example, a note to indicate that a drowned person intended to drown, it's likely that the death will be declared to be an accident. Now, figures were provided by Liu and, how do you pronounce it? Hsieh? Sonxie, right. They published figures about drowning and looked at accidental drowning and suicide. That was of interest, which I could refer to in more detail. That in Japan, the rate of drowning was 6 per 100,000, which was the highest. Most countries, it was less than 1. In Taiwan in 2020, the accidental drowning rate was 1.4 per 100,000, 78% being male, while the drowning suicide rate was reported as 1.3, so it was much the same. In Australia, and we could compare Australia with Taiwan if we have time later, in Australia, the accidental drowning rate was 0.75, and the suicide rate by drowning was 0.3, very different from Taiwan. Had Australia got it wrong, whether a lot of hidden suicides among those accidental drownings? I don't know. We don't know. And the reason for that is because it is so difficult without having a psychological autopsy or verbal autopsy to really test whether it was a real suicide or a real accident. We just don't know. And I would suspect, and I think those previous researchers would suspect, that more than 50% of cases reported as accidental drownings might have been suicides. We don't know. And that's why we've got to get much more psychological autopsy studies done to find out what the true rate is. Going back to this, this shows the accidental poisoning rates on the right in 15 jurisdictions. Of the 15, it was lowest, the accidental poisoning, in Korea and Japan, which had the highest suicide rates. It was relatively low in Taiwan, New Zealand, several European nations, including Germany. But in contrast, it was high in the 5 English-speaking countries that you've got on the list, on this list, and in Sweden, which also had comparatively high R99 and EUI rates. It did not seem, as I said earlier, that low suicide rates were necessarily associated with higher accidental poisoning rates, or vice versa. Nevertheless, there is evidence to suggest that to a variable extent, suicides have been misclassified as accidents. Let's just go to this increase in the accidental poisoning rate in the US. it was concomitant with a drop in suicide rate in those years up to 2000. But since then, we've had this opioid crisis in the US, progressively worsened. In 2011, Rocket et al. Declared that the proportion of poisoning deaths attributed to suicide seemed implausibly small. In 2018, this opinion by Oquendo and Volcker said the true proportion of suicides among overdose deaths was between 20% and 30%, but could be higher. Now, in fact, as you know, the rates, the accidental poisoning rates in the United States have progressively increased, and they got up to, I think it was nearly 30, they got up to 21.73 accidental poisoning in 2016, and it went even further than that in 2021, I think up to about 30. But the suicide rate did not keep pace at all. In fact, it stayed just about steady. And the question is, what proportion of those very high rates of accidental poisoning in the United States were due to suicide? And that I'm sure, and Rocket would be very sure, was largely due to suicides. Was that for me? Thank you very much. Thanks. So that's accidental poisoning. We've done that. We've done that. Am I going? Oh, I'm going back. Sorry. There's been a worsening opioid crisis also in Canada, but even though there was a huge increase over the years 2014 to 17, there was a fall in the poisoning suicide rate. I think the Canadian rate went up to about 13 per 100,000 or more. It went up also in England and Wales, and in some other English-speaking countries. And there's been some increase in the recognized suicide rate, and probably that does correlate with the accidental rate. But it's Canada and the US where it seems not to have been possible. So I've said that. Oh no, I'm going down the other way. Now, the surprising fall in Canada's suicide rate, I think we would expect it to have gone up because substance abuse is a known risk factor for suicide. The availability and ease of access to a lethal means, being opioids, had increased. The prescription rate for opioids is known to increase the risk of depression, but further, Canadian doctors had been urged, particularly by drug companies, to increase their prescribing and dosage of opioids in treating chronic pain, so that lethal drugs were more available to people with chronic pain who were known to have tendencies towards suicide. So I can't believe it. I can't believe that their suicide rate has not risen, and the same applies to America. Korea is interesting. I'll be brief about this. There was a reported suicide, the reported suicide rate in Korea escalated from 8 to 26 per 100,000 between those years, 92 to 2011. And the accident rate decreased from 12.9 to 5.2. And this was because they, in Korea, had taken particular attention to accidents, and they'd realized that a lot of them weren't accidents at all. They were suicides. At the same time, there was a small increase in the accident rate in Japan. But John et al. Estimated that 43% of that apparent increase in suicides reflected an increased accuracy of the data. So the Korea's figures now are pretty good. The quality of statistics in that country is particularly good now compared to what they were. And there are other reasons why their suicide rate went up. Now, this is just to draw attention to the rates of drug overdose poisoning in these various countries in 2020 to 2021. They've all gone up. The suicide rates in some have gone up. So I want to compare Taiwan and Australia a bit. I think I've got about 10 minutes left. Is that right? So let me, because it was interesting that in Australia, we had inaccuracy of reporting suicide rates in the years 2006 to 2002 to 2006. And this was recognized by a chap called Diego de Leo, recognized that the reason was that they'd got a cutoff date by which they had to have their figures ready for publication, public release. And once the cutoff date had happened, which was, I think, about 2 years after, the way it is now in Germany, about 2 years after the end of the year to which the figures related. But it meant that any coroner's cases that were still open, and there were a number of cases still open after the end of that 2 years, after the cutoff date. So these cases that had not been coded yet, and a lot were found to be suicide, they were not included in the data. Those cases would have been included as something else and could have been either R99 or as accidental. And then the coroner comes up with an opinion that in fact it was suicide, but that doesn't get into the data. So De Leo et al. Protested to the government. They started a new system for recording and publishing the data. And that really started in about 2007, got going properly in 2009, whereby they had a revision of data that had been published initially. And from that time, well, from 2009 till 2015, they published the data 15 months after the end of the relevant year. And then a year later, they would look and see how many cases from the coroner's office had been recoded, having been coded initially as either EUI or R99, being ill-defined or unknown cause. How many of those were recoded as suicides? And then a year after that, so that's 2 years after the initial publication of data, they did another revision. And this showed that there was an increase in the data recorded. So those figures were then finalized some 3 years after the end of the year in which they were first, or the year that they were looking at. 3 years after the end of that year. So now in Australia, they changed it again in 2015 so that the first release of data was 9 months after the end of the year that they were referring to. That data was called preliminary. And then there was a revised version after a further year, and then the finalized data a year after that. In fact, it works out at some 2.5 years after the end of the year that it was all pertaining to. So this was of interest, but when you come to the Taiwan data, what I understand from what I read online is that Taiwan releases its data about 9 months after the end of the year. So they've got their preliminary data, same as Australia has its preliminary data 9 months after the end of the relevant year. 6 months in Taiwan now. Very quick, and Australia keeps on saying they want to have the data out as quickly as possible so that people can look at what caused the things. But the trouble is they're missing out a whole lot of the data. And therefore, after the 3 years or 2.5 years, they've got the actual data, and it's not going to be, even if they included later data, it wouldn't be much. So I find that very interesting. And if I've got my slides up correctly, this was a summary of the release and revision of Taiwan and Australia's 2017 data, the data relating to the people who died in 2017. And as you see, Taiwan released its first data in December 19, Australia its first data in September 18. Australia had its finalized data in September 21 of the data relating to 2017, whereas Taiwan produced its first and only publication about those data in December 19. And I'll show you what happened the following year. But you will see that the suicide rate in Taiwan was 16.4 for 2017. Australia initially said it was 12.7, but by September 21, they'd raised that by 67.67 per 100,000. So it's about 5% increase. The R99 rate went down in Australia from 5 per 100,000 to about 3 per 100,000 because a lot of them had been recoded as suicide or something else. The EUI rate also went down in Australia. The accidental poisoning rate went up, interestingly, and maybe some of the, I don't know, maybe some of the accidental deaths were hidden. There were hidden accidents among those R99 rates. Accidental drowning stayed much the same, and the exposure to unspecified factor is X59. There was a slight change there. So that was interesting. And then when you look at the 2020 data, Taiwan, the data relating to the year 2020, Taiwan released its data on the 1st of October 21, and the rate was 15.5 of suicide. Australia's first and preliminary release was September 21, and that was only 12.2. But we know that by September 2024, when they finalized those data, it will have gone up, maybe not as far as 15.5. The R99 rate in Taiwan was 4.5, which is quite high compared to what Australia's was finally. But as you see, it was probably somewhat similar to what Australia's was initially. But Taiwan 2020, the R99 rate had come down, but the Australia's was miles above that. And that is because a lot of those R99 cases are going to be recoded later on. R99, ill-defined and unused, ill-defined and unknown cause deaths, that was a garbage code or a placeholder code used while waiting to decide what the coroner's court would say, and waiting for further information which could be obtained from police records, relatives, etc., that became available more than 9 months after the initial look at the suicide rates. You see that the EUI rate was rather higher in Taiwan than in Australia, and maybe some of those are hidden suicides. So really, and accidental poisoning is perhaps of interest because the rate in Taiwan is considerably lower than the rate in Australia, and we can expect the rate in Australia, when we get to the finalized data, will be higher. The accidental poisoning rate will be higher because it was for the 2017 and 2018 data. And that is because Australia, like the United States, like Canada, like some other countries, has got an opioid crisis, and people are taking far too many drugs. It's not nearly as high as Canada or the United States, but it's going up. and maybe we'll see what happens. Accidental drowning, much the same as it was previously. So I think that was the main thing I wanted to say about those data. I've left out a lot of what I could say, and I'd be happy to discuss these figures. And it may all seem very complicated and unreal, and I hope I've made it clear enough, the differences between Taiwan and Australia. But I suspect, and I'd be very interested in your opinions, I suspect that Taiwan does have far more, no, not far more, it has more hidden suicides in its data on R99 and EUI than Australia will have when Australia produces its finalized figures. And this brings up the point, Jenny, of what we were saying earlier about it would be very interesting to compare Taiwan and Australia, which have similar populations. They similarly produced good data, except that yours don't get updated after that 9 month or the 6 months period. So how much would that interfere with a comparison of our mortality data between Taiwan and Australia? How much does it matter? And that's what I'd like to ask from you. If I've got it right in my understanding of the online data that I've seen, and thank goodness Taiwan does produce lovely online data. You were talking about Germany earlier, that you can't get that till the 2 years. And even then, your 16 provinces, states, have different methods of collecting the data. We're lucky. Taiwan has a unified national data system. Australia has a unified national data system. It's just that we have finalized data after 3 years, but it is 3 years. You have finalized data after 6 months, and it is 6 months. And therefore, surely, we know you've got a coroner, surely there are cases that are still open, and therefore those data don't get included. Or do they? Have you a system of including the data that you get the later rates and add it onto a subsequent year? So that's my question to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Zhang, for your wonderful speech. And the final question is left for us to discuss later.